I've been muted for the past 30 seconds. Gotta love live podcasting, right? So, hi everyone. Happy Monday. My name is Janelle Villiers, and I am your host of the Other Side podcast, where we are all about the other side of the mental health journey that we're on. We're on the other side of growth, of being the best possible beings that we can possibly be on this journey called life that we're all on together. And I couldn't be more honored to be with you guys along with you during this journey. Today, I'm all glammed up because today was graduation day for the Sarah Lawrence Human Genetics graduates. I am so proud of you. If any of you end up watching this, I'm super proud of you. You guys have all worked really hard and you've made it this far. So congratulations again. But today I wanted to talk about an interesting topic that came to mind this morning. And let's see. This is something that I think has been difficult for me. And sorry, I'm putting it in the scrolly thing so it can scroll. I thought I had done this earlier, but apparently I hadn't. I think it's all the graduation festivities. But basically the question is it impossible to forgive? Or are there any instances when it is impossible to forgive? Are there things that people can do that are impossible to forgive? And for me, I think the deeper question is there anything that you can do, dear listener and journeyer, that you wouldn't forgive yourself for doing? I think sometimes that's the harder thing. I think many times people are able to forgive others, but the person who's hardest to forgive is ourselves. For those of you who don't know, I'm the author of a book called I Slept with a Married Man. Am I Still a Good Person? And I think for many people, that would be the thing that they couldn't forgive themselves for. I know I was in that place. I didn't even think that God could forgive me, to be honest, when I was there. I was thinking, I'm a horrible person. This just proves it. I'm like, there's something wrong with me. I'm defective, things like that. And so how could I possibly forgive myself if God wouldn't even forgive me, right? And so I don't know if there's something out there that you have done or somebody has done to you that you feel like is unforgivable. It's just simply impossible to forgive. And I want to challenge us on this notion of what is or isn't impossible to forgive. Number one, let's talk about other people. I think it was really hard for me to forgive other people who had done things to me in a moment, right? Like, let's talk about like the moment that you're in when it just happens, right? And you're just coming off of the feelings and the emotions of maybe it's betrayal, maybe it's, they made you feel angry, or you just couldn't understand how could somebody do something like that to you, right? And so you think like, there's no way that this could be forgivable. And I would suggest, especially for those of us who are believers, that this is probably the hardest thing about being a believer, right? To forgive others as we know that God has forgiven us. And I think the number one thing is, if you think that you aren't forgiven, then it becomes very easy for you not to forgive others. Right? So isn't that so interesting that that's the challenge of being a Christian, right? Of like, to accept even that you have been forgiven. What an amazing thing that you have already been forgiven for the thing that you think that you've done that you think is unforgivable. You've already been forgiven. But then the challenge is then you now have to, if you're going to try to lead a life that's Christ-like, then you get the challenge of forgiving other people who maybe have done things that you feel like are impossible to forgive. And so that is certainly challenging. And I tie that back to, if you feel like you've done something that's impossible for even God to forgive, then it's going to make it 10 times harder for you to forgive others, right? And what I've found is that when you find people like that who are just unforgiving, typically it's because they have such a high expectation of themselves and they don't feel like they're reaching the mark. And so if you definitely haven't if they haven't reached the mark, right, and whatever they're doing is unforgivable, like how could they possibly forgive you, right? And so that's why they end up being so prickly. It's probably because they're the hardest on themselves. So I don't know. This is just a thought that I had in my mind that I really wanted to talk to you guys about. If any of this is relatable to you, please put an R in the chat or put relatable so I can see it and let me know. I think this is also the stuff that we don't always talk about all the time, right? We don't always talk about the fact that, like, maybe the reason why we're having a hard time forgiving others is because we haven't forgiven ourselves for something, right? Maybe it's that. Hi, I just went on Instagram and I see that there's some people on Instagram. So hi, Mitch. Hi, Maya. Thanks for coming on. So yeah, I'm super glad that you guys are hearing this and you think it's relatable. I would like to have more dialogue about this. Lynette, you agree, right? The hardest thing to do is to forgive those that continue to hurt or misuse you. Yeah. Yeah. Forgiveness doesn't mean you have to interact with them daily. Totally agree, Lynette. Forgiveness just means that, like, you no longer are holding a grudge against that person. You're no longer holding it in your heart that they're like contemptible or whatever, right? It's just, you've just like moved on. You're like, they've done this thing. I don't need to be around them anymore. And like, you've moved on with your life. That's the other thing that's hard. The reason why it's good for you, sorry, I was thinking why it's hard to understand. The reason why it's good for you to forgive is because of what it does for you. It frees you to move on with your life. You're not like weighed down by this thing, like, oh man, this person did this thing to me. And, you know, how could I ever forgive them? But if you're like, I forgive you. You did what you did. And, you know, you probably thought you were doing the best thing that was for you at the time. It wasn't for me, but, you know, that's the way it goes. And so I'm just going to move on. And unless, you know, things drastically change, I'm not going to interact with you necessarily, but that doesn't mean that I need to like hold a grudge against you, right? It's just kind of like, I've forgiven you. You've done, you know, you did what you did and I've forgiven, I've moved on. Personally, I'll tell you guys a story. Someone who I would consider a colleague, did something to me. This is ages ago now. This isn't like currently, but I felt extremely betrayed by that person, extremely betrayed. And I was so hurt by that because I couldn't believe that that person would betray me. And I have to tell you, like, the pain that comes from the not forgiving part, right? Like there's pain in that, just like holding on to that. Oh man, I feel betrayed. And then there was a freeing. There was like a lifting. It was one, I am a believer. And so I was like, well, this person has already been forgiven by God. So, I will get to that place eventually. But there was something else that I thought about. And I was like, man, you know, if Judas hadn't done what he did to Jesus, like he played a role in it, right? Like Judas had to do what he had to do in order for Jesus to do the things that he needed to do in order to, you know, raise from the dead and all that stuff. So like he played a role in it. And what I realized is that this person who betrayed me, they needed to play that role in my life in order for certain things in my life to happen for me to move forward in another direction. If that person hadn't played that role, I might still be stuck in that same place. But because of what they did, although it was extremely painful, it moved me forward in the direction that I know is a God calling, in the direction that like I know I'm supposed to go in. Now, at the time, it was super painful. I was angry, sad. I felt betrayed, like all these things. And yet it's so freeing now that I literally hold no grudge against this person. I can see them. I can give them a hug. We can laugh, like, because I just realized they were doing the best thing that they could do for themselves at the time that they thought was great. It wasn't the best for me, but actually in the bigger picture, They needed to play that part in order for my life to move in the direction that it needed to go. So I just want to challenge all of us as we think about forgiveness, and maybe sometimes the things that we think are impossible to forgive. And maybe, just maybe, there was a reason why it happened. Maybe it needed to happen in order for you and your life to go in the direction that you've been called to go into. Something to think about. So Lene has also added, many times the most difficult forgiveness is to forgive family members who have hurt you, because many times you have to interact with them intimately. But what you say is great guidance. Yeah, 100%, right? Like, of course it's harder because you're kind of like forced to go to family functions and things like that, and you can only be distant, but by so much. But I do think if you can see the role that they played in order for it to have moved your life in the way that it wanted to, it might be easier to do that. There's a freeing in that. There's a freeness, and not of them, of you. So like, you don't have this like thing weighing you down and like causing you to get stuck. Something to think about. It's really freeing. I think the next part of this is probably the part 2 is like the forgiveness of self, which again, I still think is harder and probably the hardest of the two. I think it's a lot easier to forgive others than to forgive yourself. So we'll talk about that next time we're together. This has been a great topic. Thank you so much for all of you who chimed in and gave your advice. Mitch says that forgiveness unchains your heart. Totally agree. I completely agree with that. And so I hope you guys join me next week. I'll be back on same time, 5:30 Eastern, on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook. Thank you all for being here. I will also say, if there are any authors, have you ever thought about writing a book? Are there any authors out there? You've been thinking about it. You're like, I have this story I want to tell. Maybe it's your own. Maybe it's like me. Or maybe you're a business person and you have like a toolkit, like a workbook that you want to create to help people navigate through a challenging situation, and you want to help them through that. I'm really excited because I am actually doing my second virtual book tour summit. It's coming up in June. So it's June 3rd and June 4th. It's free. It's absolutely free. But what I'm going to do is I'm helping people get the book out of their head and actually onto paper, so that way they can self-publish. I'll even give you the steps for how to become a bestseller. So that way you can finally impact the people that you have been called to impact by your story that you want to tell. I will go ahead and put the information for that in the description below. So check that out if you want to join in. You can register. Again, it's free. Would love to have you there. Pass it on if you know anyone that like is a friend, family member who's like, oh my gosh, I want to write this book, but I don't know if I have the time. I don't know if I can do it. Send them over this link. You can thank me later. Okay, guys, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for joining me. I will see you next week. Have a great night.